The US has just hit its debt limit, and if Congress fails to increase the government's borrowing limit in time, the results could be the most devastating shock the economy has ever seen. But I'm sure you're wondering, what does that even mean, and what happens next? Well, that's what I'm going to explain to you. But first, let's cover what the debt limit actually is. You see, the debt limit is a cap on the total amount of money that the federal government is authorized to borrow to fulfill its financial obligations. Because the United States runs a budget deficit, meaning it spends more than it brings in through taxes and other revenue, it must borrow huge sums of money to pay its bills. That includes funding for social safety net programs, interest on national debt, or salaries for the troops. Now, after a long standoff in 2021, Congress agreed to raise the borrowing cap to $31 trillion. Now, I'm sure when you hear raising the debt ceiling, you think that we're just taking on more money to spend it. And that's not exactly the case. See, lifting the debt limit does not authorize any new spending, and in fact, it simply allows the United States to finance existing obligations. In other words, it allows the government to pay the bills it has already incurred. So now that we understand the debt limit, what's happening right now? Well, for years, Republicans have sought to tie spending cuts or other concessions from Democrats to their votes to lift the borrowing cap, even if it means eroding the world's faith in the United States and that it will always pay its bills. Now back in control of the Chamber of Congress, Republicans are poised to once again leverage the debt limit to make fiscal demands of President Biden. Speaker Kevin McCarthy signaled that he and his fellow Republicans would seek to use the debt limit standoff to enact spending cuts and reduce the national debt. He said that lawmakers very likely had until summertime to find a solution before the United States runs out of cash, a threshold known as X date. But the thing is, we may not have time for X date. See, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned on Friday that she would have to undertake extraordinary measures to continue paying the nation's bills beyond January if lawmakers did not act to raise the debt limit now, and that her powers to delay a default could be exhausted by early June. So as you can see, the fight over the debt limit is renewing debates about what the actual consequences would be if the United States were unable to borrow money to pay its bills, including what it owes to the bondholders who owe U.S. Treasury debt, and essentially provide a line of credit to the US government. Some Republicans argue that the ramifications of breaching the debt limit and defaulting are overblown. Democrats in the White House, along with a variety of economists and forecasters, warn of dire scenarios that include a shutdown of basic government functions, a hobbled public health system, and a deep and painful financial crisis. So before we get any deeper, let's actually look at when we will hit the borrowing cap. As said, Secretary Yellen's declaration that a default could loom as early as June signaled that there was less time to resolve the matter than some had originally estimated. And this is bad. The actual moment when the federal government can no longer fully meet its obligations on time, if it arrives without us knowing, will be a function of the Treasury Department's cash flow, which could change depending on the trajectory of the economy and the fate of certain policies. And that's the scary thing. We don't exactly know when the debt limit will be hit. But what happens if we do hit the debt limit? Well, that's a lot more clear. First off, just approaching a breach of the debt limit can hurt the economy. In 2011, congressional Republicans and President Barack Obama engaged in a standoff over spending and debt that was resolved just in time to avoid hitting the limit. However, that standoff alone had detrimental effects to the economy. Stock prices plunged and volatility in the market spiked. As lawmakers approached a debt limit breach, they did not recover for half a year. The cost of borrowing for corporations, which fluctuates with the level of risk that investors perceive in the economy, jumped substantially. That made it more expensive for companies to borrow, to make new investments, and mortgage rates spiked similarly, hampering prospective home buyers. But here was the real issue. The credit agency S&P downgraded America's credit rating for the first time ever, meaning consumer confidence in the US government was at an all-time low. Now, an actual breach would be far worse. If the Treasury Department was to default on its loans, investors would demand much higher interest rates in the future to loan money to the government. It would be similar to what happens when borrowers miss credit card payments. Their credit ratings go down, and the interest rate they pay often goes up. A scenario like this would add drastically to the government's interest rate payments, which the White House projects will cost the equivalent of 2.6% of the total American economy over the next decade. And here's the real kicker. It would threaten to destabilize the global economy because US Treasury bonds are largely seen as one of the safest investments in the world. Essentially, if the US defaults on its debt, the world economy could face the worst recession it's ever seen. So what options do we have? In the past, Treasury officials have discussed trying to prioritize certain payments, like military salaries, or delaying payments entirely for a certain period until the government has sufficient revenue to cover all of its bills. Either scenario would cause chaos in the financial markets and set off legal challenges. In late 2021, about a dozen officials in the Department Office of Fiscal Projections were tracking the size and timing of the nation's inflows and outflows of money to refine its estimates for the so-called X date. They kept close tabs on the fluctuations in non-marketable debt such as savings, bonds, and coordinated closely with the government agencies to determine their spending needs. Treasury officials also prepare for when they might have to conserve cash and suspend the daily reinvestment of Treasury securities held by the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a pot of emergency money that is supposed to be used to intervene in currency markets during times of turmoil. That is the last step before the agency's fiscal accounting maneuvers, known as extraordinary measures, would be exhausted. Now, the simple solution would obviously be to just raise the debt ceiling, but this comes with its own challenges and basically kicks the can down the road. So this will likely be an ongoing discussion moving forward. But the US isn't the only country with a keen interest in the US debt ceiling. And if you click this video now, you'll see why China needs the US to avoid its debt ceiling more than anyone.